This will be our penultimate panel looking at the role of the internet in both mitigating the economic impact of COVID-19 and fueling the recovery in the UK over the months and years ahead. The UK IGF, for those of you who don't know, is the National Internet Governance Forum for the United Kingdom. And the aim this year is to build on a lot of the discussion from last year to form a strong set of recommendations that we can take forward to the global IGF taking place at the UN in November. COVID-19 is the overall theme of the day. Previous themes have focused on trusts, inclusion, data in the environment as well. So before I hand over to the panel, just a few pieces of housekeeping. So this is a Zoom webinar. Everyone will be automatically muted with your cameras off. Please remain that way. If you have a question either during the session or afterwards, you can use the Q&A function to ask this, and the chair will pick up on these questions after the first set of panel discussion, so after the first hour. If you want your question to be anonymous, you can do so by ticking the box, and you can also chat with other attendees privately as well inside the chat function. The webinar is being recorded and will be shared on the UK IGF website afterwards. So COVID-19 has and continues to have a huge impact on everyone's working and daily lives, as well as the internet, its utilization and its governance. We have quite a challenge ahead of us, both to kickstart the economy and to ensure that kind of the wheels and the cogs are working in the same way. So we have a great panel for you who are going to address the kind of ongoing role of the internet in this post-COVID recovery with a focus on the economy. So without any further ado, I will hand over to the panel.
Good morning, and thanks for joining for this last session of what's been a fascinating UK IGF. It's a lot of pressure being the last session, but we're very fortunate to have such a great panel and a fascinating question and topic to discuss. So let me first introduce the panel, and then we'll get into discussing the topics. We have with us this morning, we have Kulveer Ranger, who's the Senior Vice President for Strategy and Communications at Atos, UK and Ireland, who's held many interesting roles in the past, as he will explain, including the complexities of transport policy, which I find just absolutely confusing and amazing at the same time. We also have Ellen Judson, who's a researcher in the Center for the Analysis of Social Media, the digital research hub at the think tank Demos, whose rich tapestry of experience and expertise includes online harms, rights, conflict, and political epistemology. And finally, we have Chi Onwurah, who's an MP and the Shadow Digital Minister, who I have to say, from experience of being on panels with her in the past, she's a breath of fresh air. She's a senior and respected politician who worked for a regulator and is a chartered engineer with a degree in electrical engineering. I don't know if you know these matters, but electrical engineering is probably the toughest form of engineering there is. So it's an incredible panel, and I'm very grateful for everybody joining us this morning. And people, the audience here, you've all read the panel description, but there were two key statements that really came out at me. The first was, and I'm just mildly reframing them, if the economic impact of COVID-19 can be mitigated, what role will the internet play? That's the first one. Second, which is kind of interdependent, but also separate, if the UK economy is to recover, what role will the internet play? And it's obvious to everybody here that we are still in the middle of this Brexit and COVID storm where with a very weak economy, with massive job losses being announced every single day. And there's massive economic infrastructure change as well, with whether it's energy and the oil markets being in chaos, property, whether it's offices or public property, and then transport being like just turned upside down every single day. Febrile global politics with countries and ideologies, again, vying for dominance anew. And finally, the strange data dominance that's occurring in the marketplace with announcements every day, such as yesterday's announcements around Oracle pulling out essentially of the European Union. And so this panel will discuss all these dynamics in great detail, highlighting the role of the internet in a hopeful economic recovery with a particular focus on the economy itself and not all the other issues that could be discussed. And essentially asking ourselves, will a new system emerge? And if there is a new system, how will it reflect the old system? Which parts will remain and which parts will be discarded? How are firms shaping as well as adapting to the post-COVID world? And what does this mean for trade in the post-Brexit landscape? And so for the discussion today, we've broken up into essentially three framings, like what is the current environment, what does the future landscape look like, and what is the future economic model? And so with the first, I'm gonna ask the panelists to reflect on what's happened over the last 6 months and where we are now. And starting with Ellen, I was wondering if you could describe your background on these issues and help us frame what it means today that more people's lives are online in this current environment.
Thanks, Gus, and thanks everyone for joining us for this session. So I'm a researcher for CHASM, which is the digital research hub at Demos, and our work is really focused at the moment on how we can be working towards a positive vision for the internet and the role that it's playing in our society. So we're trying to define, measure, and then advocate for ways that the internet can be working for everybody, promoting digital rights, promoting democratic rights. So I personally have been working on issues around privacy, anonymity, disinformation, gender, so a sort of whole host of issues relating to kind of online life. And most recently, we've been looking at online life in the context of COVID and what we've seen happening over the last few months. So we've been looking at people's experiences during the pandemic, relating to technology, relating to how they've been using the internet, and whether that relationship has changed or stayed the same. And sort of unsurprisingly, our kind of first results from this work has found that a very high proportion of people who we engaged with said that they'd relied more on technology during the pandemic. People were talking about how it had really been a lifesaver, how it had meant that they could continue to work, it meant that they could continue to socialize, they could continue to exercise, do all their group activities that you know a decade ago wouldn't have been possible in the same way. And a majority of people we talked to also said that they'd learned to use new technologies during the pandemic, Zoom being a particular favorite that many people previously was just sort of a business tool, but now has kind of become where we're having pub quizzes and family get-togethers. But as well as all this kind of positivity and really kind of embracing of online services, we found a lot of frustration and a lot of concern amongst a lot of people. People saying they're not comfortable using technology and everything suddenly going online has been this sort of massive shock that they weren't quite sure how to deal with. People who aren't able to afford the kind of devices that you need to get online. And people who are living in places that the internet access is not good, speeds are very slow, and saying, you know, I'm trying to do all these online things that everyone else is doing, but it's just a lot harder. Everything takes longer. I have to walk to the several miles away and hold my phone above my head to try and get a signal just so that I can get a WhatsApp message. And then there's people who didn't know how to use online services and felt they were kind of just being pressured into it in a way that they weren't comfortable with. And other people who could get online but felt that were just very worried about kind of what they were going to experience once they got there. So hostility, misinformation, a lot of worries about privacy coming out, particularly given the kind of discussions around the use of data to address the pandemic itself. So I guess kind of what I've taken from where we've got to over the last 6 months is we're kind of in a strange place right now. And the next steps look quite uncertain. Maybe we'll see more lockdowns. There's going to be people working from home for a long time, if not indefinitely. We may be seeing more online school happening, online university. And at the same time, we're still in this public health crisis, and people need to be able to get good information online. They need to be able to access services online when those things just aren't available in offline versions. But what we haven't yet done is really work out what the standards of this new kind of increased everything going online life should be. We've got a misinformation crisis around COVID particularly, and we've seen some action from platforms trying to deal with it, but really kind of lots of gaps in that response. We've seen that as soon as people start using a new technology in a new way, so like Zoom, as soon as Zoom becomes this great thing that everybody is using, we start seeing abuse on Zoom and Zoom bombing, and kind of reports of that really escalating. And then we've got this kind of strange blurred boundaries between what's private and what's public when we're online. We've seen stories about students who are taking exams online and being asked to kind of show the camera or their private space around them to prove they're not cheating, and a lot of people obviously very kind of unhappy about that because it feels very intrusive. And we haven't worked out how to ensure people have equal access to this online digital society. So it sort of feels like we're playing catch up at the moment, and we need to be getting out in front of these problems, building the digital society that we want to be seeing, rather than just reacting to problems as they come up. And so, as my kind of feelings on how we should do that, we need to be talking to people about what their experiences are, and finding out what they really want to stay the same, what they want to change, what they've learned, and that's what we're trying to do at the moment.
That's fantastic, and I like the positive vision in the listening aspect, and I wonder how much both of those change at any moment in time. Whereas a positive vision 3 months ago would be different than a positive vision today, and same with what people would actually say. Chi, I was wondering if you could also describe your background on these issues and tell us what you think are the pressing political issues of today based on your current workload.
Thanks very much, and it's great to hear from the other panelists, and thanks very much for your introduction, Gus, and it's absolutely great to be here. I think the IGF is an important global and UK institution with a really important role to play. And yes, as Gus said, so I'm the Member of Parliament for Newcastle upon Tyne Central, greatest city in the world, in my view. I'm also the Shadow Minister, so the Labour spokesperson on digital science and technology. And I am a chartered engineer. And I would say that, so since the age of 9, which is a long time ago now, I've wanted to be an engineer. I've been in engineering and in technology and science. I am, self-confessed tech evangelist, and I graduated from Imperial in 1987 and spent 20 years working all over the world, Nigeria, the US, France, the UK, building out the networks which are now part of the internet. And I did that because I thought that technology, the technology that is an engine of progress to bring people together, to drive economic development, to drive social cohesion, all the, in fact, amazing and sort of empowering experiences that tech can realize. And particularly one of the things I'm proudest of is building out the first GSM network in Nigeria with a company called MTN, and seeing the transformations around 2000, the time of the dot-com bubble, if you remember that, when tech was being slated in the US and Europe. In Nigeria, seeing the transformation that having effective communications could make, whether it was fishermen in the delta knowing what the prices were of the fish, so they weren't diddled by the marketeers, or whether it was pregnant women being able to call for a doctor rather than sending someone to run for that. So I'm a tech evangelist. I joined after 20 years in the private sector. I joined Ofcom in 2004, and then I remember being sent by the Ofcom board to a discussion about this thing called the internet, security on the internet, and coming back with the tales of white hat wizards and honey traps and spams and scams and phishing and farming, and the board is like I was coming from talking about a war in a galaxy far, far away, And I want to say, that was 15 years ago. And my real sense of disappointment and disillusion is that I don't believe that the industry has moved on very far since then. The scams, you know, the challenges, the lack of have become a real part of everyday life. They're not something that you report upon in a seminar. They're something that you experience, that a lot of people experience the moment they pick up their phone or look on the web. And yet the industry, in terms of responding and protecting people, hasn't moved on. You know, it's about, I think, a couple of months since I now get text messages on my phone when they think that somebody is a scam. If somebody's calling me is a scam. Do you recognize this number? Is this a scam? That, you know, that technology was something I was arguing for 10 years ago when I first entered Parliament, because one of the things that I wanted to do in Parliament was to champion, if you like, technology for the people. And so I suppose where we were pre-COVID, I think, was technology was increasingly part of everyday's life, but I would say that the industry had not woken up to the need to protect and to incentivize trust, not incentivize, but to justify trusting technology. And I particularly remember at Davos this year, which was just before COVID became widespread, you know, there was a lot of talk about the tech clash. And then COVID happened. And that, you know, that has changed all our lives. And we have made, you know, people, some more than others have made huge sacrifices as part of the battle against this disease. And technology has been really instrumental in helping us to, you know, come together, to understand the issues around it, to communicate the challenges, to address some of the issues, to develop new vaccines, which we hope we'll see. But also, as we heard from from Ellen, we are spending so much more of us are spending so much more of our lives online, and this Zoom webinar is an example for that. And that has been, you know, both good, you know, and bad. So it's highlighted the fantastic ability of technology to support and enlarge our lives, you know, grandparents seeing their grandchildren more than they might have done without COVID, online at least. But it's also highlighted the digital divide, which is significant. You know, the children who in my constituency who do not have access to a device to do online learning and are now, you know, months behind their peers in particularly in public schools. You know, those who do not have the skills to address. I have many constituents who didn't have the skills to get access to the support that was there, but that was only available online. And particularly those of us like myself, you know, as an MP who could work from home, well, until the government decided that we wanted us to be visible, but who could work from home, and that was people with higher levels of education, generally in jobs where you could do it at home, and those who have to go out on the front line, risking their lives often, but also whose jobs in hospitality and other sectors are the ones that are going to be cut. So, you know, I'm also, you know, like Ellen, I want to be optimistic, and I am by nature an optimist. And what I hope is that this moment, this COVID moment, is actually going to be a sort of call to arms, you know, because we see both the advantages, the strengths of technology, and the disadvantages. The fact also that it's so concentrated, power is so concentrated in so few hands. Jeff Bezos, his personal wealth has gone up by 75 billion during COVID. You know, he's a winner. He's definitely a winner. You know, the share prices of Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Google, Apple are the reason why the U.S. stock market is actually gone up during COVID. You know, and that's only because of those 5 stocks. So there have been real winners, and there have been so many losers. And if we talk about economic recovery, you know, and this COVID crisis has come as we were in the process of a transition to what is called the 4th Industrial Revolution. It's not particularly a term I like. Growing up in Newcastle, where the 1st Industrial Revolution started, I'm not sure how they're counting industrial revolutions, but actually, anyway, let's call it the 4th Industrial Revolution. That's we're a moment of a transition to that. We're also now transitioning to a post-COVID economy. COVID has shown us actually that change can happen at lightning speed in our society if we make the right kind of investments and decisions. It's also shown us, you know, that an active government can, you know, protect citizens and protect jobs. And so what I want to see as part of this COVID moment is technology empowerment for citizens, support for a transition to the fourth industrial revolution, so that's retraining, and a strong, more competitive environment for new technologies and new businesses. And that all requires a robust regulatory framework, citizen ownership and or control of their own data, and support for skills and addressing the digital divide. And that's what Labour stands for. That's unfortunately what we're not seeing. We haven't yet had the online harms white paper, but I understand that it's only going to look at legal harms and not all the many other harms that are experiencing. So this is a moment of choice, and we can choose the future that technology offers us, but we have to make the right choices and make sure we have the right legislative environment.
Thanks, Chi. I love that framing of a moment of choice. And I like the arc, which is like there was this moment of like before there was so much optimism and the thought of tech as progress and cohesion, and then we have what we have now, which is one would have hoped we would have been better ready for this. And yet we weren't. And what are we going to do next? Kulveer, I was wondering if you could do the same, which is describe your background on these issues, but also help us frame this idea, because like at one moment we're talking about the internet, the next moment we're talking about tech. What is it? What do you think is going to be the framing of this engine of growth if it does emerge?
Try that again. Hi everyone, and delighted to be part of this UK IGF 20 conference, and delighted to be on this panel. Thanks for inviting me. And Gus, huge topics that both Ellen and Chi have raised. So I just want to touch on that choice point that Chi was raising there as well, just before I go into a bit of my own sort of view on this and my background on it. It is a moment of choice. And the key thing, and I work for a business called Atos. We're a global technology business. We're number one in Europe for cybersecurity services. We're globally recognized by the Dow Jones Sustainability Index as being number one for delivering sustainable digital services. Now, why am I saying that? Yes, because I work at this business, but because there's something behind all this front end that is also required, how businesses will support the future and what they've been doing to not prepare for a crisis like this, because obviously that's hard, but absolutely there's been a direction of where we're heading around choices we're making in how technology will support society, be that sustainable, be that secure, and she was raising the issue of trust, and Ellen was raising the issue of kind of the risks that people are now seeing. And these things have been looked at in the background, but they're coming to the fore more because they're coming to people's awareness due to this turbocharged acceleration of digitalization and digital adoption through the current pandemic. But look, my view on this is that, I've spent the last 25 years in industry. I started off working on major infrastructure program projects, majority in the transport sector. And unbeknown to me, they all had a large dollop of technology at their heart, and that was becoming more and more part of what we were trying to do. So I was involved in helping set up the program office for the GSMR network, which is the mobile phone network for the railways, and so that they could have their own band on there, and also involved in delivering the Oyster card in London, which was it was a transport infrastructure program, but what it was looking at was massive revenue protection, a smart card platform, culture change around contactless technology, e-money, all these things. And by the way, that was way back in 2003. Feels like a blink of an eye, but it was quite a long time ago. So over that sort of decade, I saw dramatic change happening in infrastructure, but the involvement of technology in infrastructure and the impact it was having on broader society. And then, as probably some people know, I worked for the Mayor of London, Boris Johnson, from 2008 to 2012. And there, yes, I was looking at transport policy for the greatest city in the world, London, but also, what was the impact that that technology was having, not just on the delivery of services, but on the economy of London. That was the moment when we were heading into the startup Silicon Roundabout, which turned into Tech City, and all that sort of bubble around new businesses and the excitement around it. And that led into other things about, right, how do we capitalize on this from an economic perspective? How do we draw both investment from big tech businesses as well as grow innovation and enterprise and entrepreneurship in London and obviously in the UK? But the other point of this from a landscape perspective, and I just want to put this in a little bit of context, is from my perspective, I've seen a number of what we call crises happen through my lifetime / career. And what do I mean by that? Well, you know, I can absolutely remember the recessions of the 90s. I can remember the banking crisis of 2008, because it was the moment we were in City Hall and we were faced with that crisis where councils, businesses all felt a fiscal challenge, and we had to manage our way through that. And now in 2020, we have a health crisis, the pandemic, and how do we manage this? And technology, the way we respond and react, our political leadership, but also how people come together. And I think this is a critical point, especially now. How do the public sector, the private sector, come together to do the right things and the best things for society now and for the future? And I think that's an essential point. And I think that's really been happening at this point, as we've seen immense change occur rapidly due to the need to respond and react to this situation, that government, private sector, politicians have united around a common cause. And I think that's a real learning that we need to pick up on as we go forward. But I think fundamentally, what we've got to really sort of think about in terms of landscape perspective is, yes, we're making some reaction and response right now, but how does that play out in the long term? Because if anybody who's been involved in policy development knows, good policies take a period of time to gestate. And there's a reason for that, because there can always, even on good policies, be unforeseen consequences. And whenever we have a fast, rapid response to things, sometimes the things that we haven't prepared for from policy can have a negative impact on what we were expecting. So I think we need to be also aware of we're dealing with the situation now, but we're looking at a future that's going to be a long-term change. And that's why we talk about, okay, what is going to be the best? And I talk about this, but from a business perspective, we want to talk about the digital society, about taking everyone with us. And I know Chi has mentioned that, and I know politicians from all sides are keen on this. And it's one of the reasons that I picked that up from my time at City Hall to my time in industry, because absolutely, we don't want people to feel that technology is happening or being done to them. And that's fundamentally a point that can happen when we're in a crisis scenario, that a lot of things can be placed upon individuals, demands made of people, and all for good reasons. But we need to do it in a way that it takes people with us and they feel that they have ownership and a say in what's happening as we enter this new era of a digital society. And it is going to be an era of digital society. Yes, this particular moment in time, we're turbocharging certain activities. The way we manage health, you know, we'll go into, no doubt, track and trace and various other things around data and personal data around health. But also, yes, our lifestyles, work, leisure, family, everything feels like it's dramatically changing. But a lot of the infrastructure and foundations for this have been in place for some time. So it's taking people with us as they now begin to feel the full effect of these foundations of services, but also have a say in how they want them to be, how they want them to develop, and what kind of governance they'd like, what kind of security they want to feel, therefore the trust that they'll have, and feel that sense of ownership. Because I think one of the things that can be lost as we go forward in this conversation, and she mentioned some of the big businesses, is that the digital side belongs to these businesses or industries. It doesn't. It will belong to all of us, because as Tim Berners-Lee's original view of the internet was, and he keeps saying, it's for everyone, it's for all of us. And I think we need to remember that, the heart of everything we do as we develop and design the digital future.
Thanks for that, Kulveer. And I really like the emphasis that's coming out around the question of infrastructure rather than just say intranet. And I also like the framing of digital society, but like what's emerging from your discussion around infrastructure and from everybody's points around infrastructure is that it's not just technical infrastructure, it's the market opportunities that come along with infrastructure, but also the way that infrastructure engages with citizens and consumers and their demands and expectations, but also policy infrastructure. And I think that's a good opportunity to move to the second framing, which is like, what does the future look like? And what are the key economic challenges on the immediate horizon, and what are the possible benefits? And essentially, I want each of the panelists to describe what keeps them up at night, but also gets them excited every day because of this rich and fascinating and problematic environment that we've just described for ourselves. And like, I'll start with my own, which is over the summer, there was a huge court decision called the Schrems case of the European Court of Justice, which was about whether or not data, personal data, particularly from the regulated environment of the European Union, can flow to the United States. And the European Court of Justice yet again said, no, it shall not flow because the US law is so weak, particularly around the conduct of intelligence agencies and national security. And so it's too dangerous to allow this flow of data without strong enforcement of some kind of regulatory regime. And you lay that court decision on with the UK environment where we have the current state of the Brexit debate seeming to focus around issues of state aid, the regulatory divergence, and competition regulatory power. And so we actually see uniquely the UK possibly setting itself up to be more US-like in the future, when the US might stop being like the US, where you have these court decisions essentially saying, what is the fabric of your regulatory state? And are you going to regulate in the ways that people and business and other needs are articulating that it has to occur? So this is a confusion for me, but it's also an exciting ground to see what does the future of Britain look like. So let me head back to you, Kulveer. What are your worries and inspirations and aspirations for what's to come? And what do you think the public sector and the private sector in Britain have to do?
I think, you know, from a worries perspective, it's more about how do we grasp this opportunity right now? And there's several different areas of that. There's fundamentally a challenge around skills, and we can all see it. I think it's an ONS report that recently highlighted that sort of a significant part of the UK population has almost zero digital skills. Now, what does that mean? Well, we're not talking about being coders and developers and things like that. We're talking about using digital platforms and being comfortable in accessing digital technology. And yes, this pandemic has forced a certain amount of the population to adopt and become more au fait and useful in those skills. But that's a critical point, because we're going to have to augment society almost, as it has to find ways of being able to access, utilize, and take advantage of platforms, because otherwise we could find segregation. And for me, that is a worry. It's not just a political worry. It's a worry from a commercial perspective. We don't want to see commercial segregation in society where people can only access certain services if they have certain skills, because from a market perspective, that doesn't help. If you're finding that markets are moving in bulk, whether that be retail, commerce, even public services such as health, education, into digital environments, you can't have large areas of those markets unable to access and utilize the opportunities and the services that are being provided there. So it's essential from both commercial, corporate, and yes, public sector, that we look at digital skills. There's a fundamental other part to that, which is businesses. And I don't mean digital businesses here. It's always a question when we talk about digital businesses, people start thinking of startups or the big tech businesses. No, we mean traditional businesses. And actually for the last 2 years, we at Atos have run a campaign and done a lot of research under the Great British Enterprise Campaign, which was before the COVID pandemic hit. But it was looking at what are the opportunities and potential for UK PLC in adoption of more digital technology. So traditional businesses having access to skills so they can use digital platforms, but adopting those and what sort of potential that would unleash in terms of productivity, in terms of greater growth and significant availability in that traditional business model. And the question there is, it shouldn't sit just on government shoulders to say, how do we help all these businesses to adopt more digital platforms for doing their accounting, for doing their manpower management, to doing supply chain, whatever it may be. But how can larger industry help that as well? And it always comes back to, I remember things like Business Link and services like that really helped businesses in previous eras. And we've made a case that there's a need for something like an enterprise portal or account that can help businesses that are traditional, haven't really adopted digital technology and platforms as yet, to get an easy access to these things. Because the other part of it is, and we can all be honest about it, sometimes it's just all too confusing. Where do we find the information? There's so much out there. Where do I begin? How do I start? And that was, again, things like Business Link, Business Advisory was fantastic in helping people navigate a complex array of offers and services that were available. So skills for people, skills for business. And I think I'm hugely confident and more keen to see that the opportunities are capitalized on across the UK. I think there's a geographical spread. Now, I know the political terminology about levelling up is used at the moment, but I think that is something that's going to be really important, which we looked at as we looked at the Great British Enterprise Campaign, but even more so now, as something like levelling up combined with the effect of COVID and people working from different geographies that they were previously, so not coming into, say, the city centres or being more dispersed in how they work, could really also be a huge part of how we look at enterprise being spread and wealth creation, innovation being spread across the country. And I think that's a great opportunity on something that everybody wanted to see anyway, and we can further take forward now because we've got people, yes, unfortunately forced into an environment where they're doing it, but businesses really and government needing to think, how do we retain the benefits of that whilst ensuring that obviously key parts of the economy keep going? And we know that there is a question around how do city centres and dense urban environments also evolve as they see a different way in terms of people coming in and out of that particular environment. So I think key areas, skills, business development, but also geography. And these things all have been changing, turbocharged in some cases, but real opportunities for growth if we link in together industry and government and local government to find the right ways of managing it.
That's a fascinating answer, and it, like, one of the simpler indicators of how that's been how that's arisen just over the last period is just looking at company websites and whether or not they were able to update them in order to reflect what's going on with COVID. And whether it's little shops or medium-sized organizations or large ones, they've all struggled in different ways. And there have been a few surprises along the way because it comes down to the question of skills, but also traditional businesses. That's very helpful. Chi, how about you? Like, what keeps you up and gets you excited every day about this domain? And what brave issues you think can and must be raised, and what kind of decisions have to be made now by our politicians in order to build this environment?
Well, thanks very much, Gus, and that's a great question. And I think what keeps me up right now, and is firstly actually the job losses that we are going to see. And only part of that is if you like technology related. It's mainly a consequence of COVID. But as Kulvia talked about the impact of COVID on our high streets, and that I mentioned earlier the dominance of Amazon in delivery, we are seeing significant job losses from those sectors, from the hospitality sector, from all those sectors that can't actually go online. So from theatre, the entertainment, sport, but also manufacturing, the airline industry, we're going to see, and you know, someone who grew up in the Northeast in the 80s, I've seen mass unemployment, and it has, and this is going to be even on a larger scale than that, and without the strong public services that we had in the 80s. We've had 10 years of austerity which have undermined our local public services and indeed communities. So the impact of mass unemployment on individuals' lives and on sort of our social fabric at a time when we are divided as a nation, or have been, you know, that is what keeps me up at night, and the way in which people are going to, it's going to impact individual lives, and the potential for a generation, or in fact generations, because older workers are not going to be, older and younger workers are both going to be affected, to suffer mass unemployment. And the longer any individual remains unemployed, the longer they will remain unemployed. So that's what keeps me up at night. The other thing that keeps me up at night is the sort of the what I would call the data chaos that we have now. And one of the things I do want to say is that, you know, it is possible, it would have been possible to do a sort of forward-looking regulatory review of data in the same way that the Labour government did of communications convergence in 2002-3, and have a sort of a forward-looking regulatory framework for data as we did have for comms in the 2003 communications bill. But we didn't do that. So what we have now is we have, you know, so many different data sharing protocols, or not sharing protocols. We have GDPR, but as you mentioned, and the implications of firstly, you know, a no deal Brexit, combined with the issues on the US, and as you talked about, we becoming more closer to the US in terms of our data regime, though, combined with the national data strategy, which we heard about over the last few weeks, in which there's a quote which I find really distressing, which is to say, to build on the high watermark of data sharing that the pandemic has shown. And I don't think it's shown a high watermark of data sharing, and I don't think a pandemic is the right environment to determine long-term policy for data sharing and for data. And the fact is that we don't have a robust regulatory framework for data. We don't have, and we saw that, you know, the algorithm debacle, which I think has really impacted people's trust in future technologies, but was again about using people's data, individuals' data, in a way which was not accountable to those individuals, to the children, the school children who called me in tears when those A-level results came out. So what keeps me awake is our current data chaos, and what encourages me is I would say the resilience of individuals, and you know, and the innovation of technology. So people have adapted hugely to COVID and to being online, and we saw seeing, you know, greater calls for regulatory, you know, I think there were particularly for regulatory and for greater concerns about the surveillance capitalism, as it's called, you know, the misinformation that we see around COVID-19, as well as around sort of the US presidential election and our politics generally, but particularly, and about 5G, you know, but there's more awareness and sort of resilience and calls for change, and then, you know, technology has moved quickly. You know, the infrastructure that we've had in the UK has moved quickly to support more innovation. For example, we'll take Zoom's response to become a more secure platform than it was at the beginning of this pandemic, and the applications and support for group activities online. So I think we are, you know, we need action, and we need action particularly from governments in terms of a proper robust regulatory framework. And and that's one of the reasons why, because I think the response and the solutions will come from people. That's one of the reasons why Labour has launched its consultation called Our Digital Future, which is open for submissions now, and I'll put the link in the chat, and I'd really encourage people to submit about what choices we should be making now to ensure that we have a digital future which is about empowerment. It's about a highly skilled, digitally skilled workforce. It's about technology, if you like, for the many, and what we should be doing now to ensure that in the future. And I'll put the link in the chat now.
Thanks. And I'm looking at the chat, and I have to agree with some of the comments in there, particularly the statement that data chaos is a wonderful phrase. I've never heard that one before, and I hope that appears more and more in the future, because that does capture a lot of what's going on. But equally, I like the example of Zoom, because I think going into the pandemic and the lockdown, the issue of end-to-end encryption really was boring to most people, and all of a sudden it became fascinating. And then Zoom even managed to screw that up further and made it even more fascinating. And here we are using it now. And so, Ellen, how about you? What gets you excited? But also what keeps you up at night? But what can people do, and what must be done for them?
So yeah, I agree with a lot of what's been said by Chi and Colvia. And I guess what I'm worried about in the midst of this kind of turbocharged, to use Colvia's phrase, move online of so much of our lives, is really kind of, on the one hand, challenges that individuals are going to be facing. We've talked about scams, we've talked about disinformation, of course, the kind of abuse and harassment that individuals sometimes have to face when they're engaging in these online spaces. And I worry that with everything having kind of moved so quickly, we haven't got adequate responses in place to kind of support people through that, and to help people be aware of what some of the risks are and how they can kind of mitigate them. But then, as we've just been discussing about Zoom, at the macro level, we've got commercial platforms that are really determining what principles are governing these spaces. So whether or not a space should be end-to-end encrypted, what it is, what's an appropriate level of privacy for a particular space, when is a space public, when should certain rules apply in one space and not in others, how should content be moderated online, who should be doing this. And it's commercial platforms who are essentially making these decisions in line with their business interests, and to some degree potentially to avoid regulation. But we've seen that self-regulation over the last few months just hasn't been working, and platforms have been doing more on COVID than they have been on other issues, with the introduction of kind of information centers and being a bit more strict on what content they will take down, and rather than leaving things up. But there's still a lot of gaps in those responses, and I think that's the thing that worries me, is that kind of lack of accountability and transparency around who is making decisions about these things that are kind of governing our lives right now, and why are they making those decisions? What's the basis? What gets me excited and kind of more optimistic than that, I think, is the fact that there is so much kind of energy and potential right now around kind of reforming how we relate to the internet and how we view the internet. I mean, even in the kind of COVID context, we've seen the WhatsApp group go from something which maybe was just between kind of friends, or you might be in a news WhatsApp group, to really kind of being a way that mutual aid is being delivered by communities, between neighbors, connecting people who maybe didn't talk to each other, maybe didn't know each other, but are willing to kind of help out in a crisis. And I think seeing that kind of energy, that people are willing to say, okay, we've got this tool, how do we make it work for us? How do we make it help us do what we want to do, and to try and see our way out of this crisis, rather than it be a thing. Calvera, I thought your phrase, we don't want technology being something that is done to people. I totally agree. Seeing people kind of grasp it and say, okay, how are we going to make this what we want it to be? So I guess in terms of kind of what people can do, that's kind of a great example of where people talk a lot about WhatsApp groups and the dangers of WhatsApp groups, and they're full of misinformation and everything. But that's a really positive example of how people have used that for good. And of course, people have kind of individual responsibilities when they're engaging in online spaces, using online services. We've talked about 5G. Obviously, anti-vax misinformation is an increasing worry as we hopefully get closer to a vaccine. And well-intended individuals may be sharing stories, actually trying to help people be informed, but which has the opposite effect if those stories aren't accurate. So there's clearly things that people can do around not sharing things that they haven't verified, and not engaging in kind of very shocking or divisive behavior online. But I think what's really important to highlight is that as we're moving towards this digital society with more and more things happening online, it's not really fair to put the burden of fixing the implications of these decisions being made by these huge multinational corporations on individual users, and to say, okay, so we've got a problem with say abuse, so then individuals need to be reporting it, individuals need to be blocking people, individuals need to keep themselves safe. And those are all really important things that we make sure that individuals can do, but it shouldn't just be down to them. If we have online spaces kind of systematically excluding certain groups, amplifying certain narratives, one person can't fix that whole problem, and we need kind of collective system change, and change to kind of how the principles on which these platforms are operating. And I think that's where the UK has an opportunity to help produce regulation and kind of set the standard for kind of international regulations that are based on evidence about what works, to really kind of promote the digital and democratic rights we want to see online. And I guess the other element of that, as we've talked about, is people also can't fix their digital infrastructure by themselves. If they have rubbish broadband, or if they don't know how to get onto the internet, they need support with those things. And that's another thing that I would hope that this kind of moment of change, moment of choice, would make people really think about.
And that's fantastic, particularly that point about it's not about individual action. There's no guide that we can create saying, click here, and then all these problems will be fixed on your account and everybody else's account. I think that's a wonderful framing around the systemic change, that we're seeing a call across the world for systemic change in order to address problems that are bigger than what a mere individual can undertake. So the final part of this panel, before we get into the question and answer phase, I just wanted to ask very specifically what you think the emerging or the new or the adapting economic model actually requires from the internet and digital services specifically. And are we hopeful that we can achieve those specific changes? So Kulveer, starting with you, for a viable economy, what must internet and digital services become? And what can the UK specifically do?
Actually, it builds on what Ellen was just saying, because actually for a number of years, I've spoken about this personal digital ecosystem that we have all built. And what I've meant by that is that we have all got devices, the infrastructure. So smartphones, iPads, laptops, all this kit that we've acquired over time. We've then also got, we've acquired digital platforms, the social media platforms, LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram. So we have platforms, we have kits, and then we have our connectivity. And that's our broadband, our Wi-Fi, our emerging 5G. These three elements, we as individuals to a certain degree have built around us to create our personal digital ecosystem. And so far, up until this point, they were being accessed by people to sell to us, to directly get in touch with us, market to us, influence us. And that's where it's been. Now, what we're seeing, and it was slowly happening, but obviously accelerated, is the civic digital ecosystem, the need for government to overlap into our ecosystem to help us. And that's where things like track and trace come in. That's where the two start to merge. And then you add on to that the corporate ecosystem, where how do we work? Now I'm not going into a corporate bubble, I'm doing it from somewhere else. So you've got these three ecosystems, the civic, the corporate, and the citizen, coming together. And I think this is the opportunity and the modeling that we need to do to understand now the economic model around this. Because Ellen's highlighted a fundamental challenge we face about how do we manage our own system, right? How do we get the broadband to work better? How do we get the devices? But there are also barriers to entry to these. And I will continue to talk, and I think everyone has raised the point, about a society, a digital society, which must be inclusive to these areas. So as we look at these ecosystems, we need to ensure that people find the right routes into them, and we get more and more people having access to that, but then being able to actually own them and work with them properly. And the big responsibility there sits with corporates and government and local government, because those are the guys who are now going to have a huge opportunity to open up ecosystems and make them accessible, make them easy to use. And then they will also drive economic usage. Right? That's where businesses, enterprise, again, I come back to the case of, how do we augment traditional business to digital platforms? Well, that's all great if they do that, but then they need to have access to the market through these ecosystems. So there's a real model that has developed organically, which now government and corporates need to understand and bring that together with the citizen, because that way also the citizen retains a heavy investment of voice and control of their ecosystem. It has been a bit, Gus, let's be honest, and I know she has coined the sort of data chaos. It was also a bit of the Wild West when it came to e-commerce. People were selling stuff, we're buying stuff, we're bidding for stuff, we're doing stuff. And what did we get in return sometimes for giving away our data, our email addresses, our cookies that were coming onto? Probably not a lot. A lot of value was being generated in other areas around data capture, but not that much being returned to the citizen or the end user. And I think this model also needs to start identifying the value that individuals get when they have these transactions, and we start to balance out what people get in return for what they're giving away. So I think plenty of opportunity, but let's ensure that people get a clear view of the modeling. And this is the way I see it. There'll be other ways of seeing it, but fundamentally, I think the citizen, the civic system, the civic ecosystem, and the corporate ecosystem are coming together. We've got great opportunity there.
I always like how you break up the problems in those three types of domains, and particularly your mention of local government. That's been a framing that, apart from the war between Newcastle and London in this discussion, we haven't really discussed that much further. Chi, how about you? What must policymakers build and achieve to tackle these problems for tomorrow?
Well, thanks very much. And the part of the challenge of the sort of the framing that Culver made between the government, the business, and the civic, and including local government, is that the power is all with the big tech companies. My local authority, Newcastle, which has 10 years of austerity, which has made huge cuts and is trying to do with COVID, cannot redress that power balance. It is only really government, national government, that can do that and can enable and empower local governments and local authorities and individuals. So I think it's really important what Culver said about your individual sort of ecosystem, to have that power themselves, and that has to be by putting in place the sort of the right regulatory framework. So the economic model is flawed because it allows these huge amounts of concentration of power and of money. I mean, the billions that these big companies, the billions of billions that they have, extracted from a business model which takes data from people for free. And I love the phrase that says, we thought we were searching Google. Actually, Google was searching us and making its business model, as Facebook, etc., from our data into adverts. And there isn't, as someone who worked for a competition regulator, I can tell you the competition regulation at the moment does not address the power imbalance in data, because it looks at pricing mainly. Our regulatory framework doesn't do that, and I'm really concerned that the government, and I know that Caroline Dinage spoke yesterday about the online harms bill, which would basically it's going to be expecting tech companies to police, if you like, their own terms and conditions, rather than setting in place, you know, a rights, digital rights and data rights, you know, for citizens, so that we can, you know, as Culver talked about, take back power and take back ownership. So that's one of the really important things that needs to happen. Secondly is regionally, and again, you know, there's been, and Culver talked about this as well, you know, there's been sort of concentration, you know, on London, you know, as a tech giant. And I think that what government and what the companies need to do is to ensure, you know, both a better regional spread, and also after, you know, Black Lives Matter and Me Too, yet we still see a really white and male tech sector, you know. And if you're not representing the people whose lives you're changing, you are not going to be changing them for the better. And we see that also with the one of the things that technology does is to industrialize bias. Unless, you know, I always say, if it is not diverse by design, it will be unequal by outcome. And again, we saw that, we see that now with algorithms. So the other, so let's say, you know, that's a redressing the power, regulatory framework that redresses the power, regional and diversity, and then finally standards. And standards will also address some of the challenges that Culver rightly raised about the barriers to entry. And I'm talking about standards for data sharing, for data movement, also Internet of Things standards for security, standards for the smart environment that we are creating now without any standards to make, allowing the existing tech giants to just simply capture it, because we haven't got the right open standards in place, which can allow new innovative companies to come in and work with our data under our, you know, license, as it were, to create new applications and new ways of working together. And we're not doing enough on the standards for it. And I think that's also something that the Internet Governance Forum can really also play a leading role in.
Thanks, Chi. And I have to say I have a particular interest in the direction of competition regulation, because they seem to be entering the landscape right now. The EU is investigating the Google Fitbit merger or purchase, and my own organization's involved in this. And I think there is a moment where we will hopefully see a sea change in the approach to competition policy as a result. Ellen, how about you draw this to a close? Like, what do you think internet and digital services should become, and what would you qualify as a success in the future if these challenges have been addressed? Because all the other speakers have essentially picked up on your challenge around this being a need for systemic change around a titanic struggle, as she put it. So yeah, where do we go from here?
So I think what's really kind of come out from this discussion is that what we want to be seeing is internet and digital services that are accessible to everybody and inclusive of everybody, and that are really kind of have those principles at their heart. I think another thing that is important to keep in mind, though, is that we don't want internet and digital services to become compulsory for everybody to use in all situations, because there's always going to be cases where it doesn't work for everybody. It's not what people prefer or value, and I think that's been a slight kind of lesson of the last few months as well with COVID, where we've seen sometimes a sort of technological solutionism of, if we have an emergency problem, we can fix it with tech and everything will be fine. And then we've seen the kind of the test and trace app that was meant to be ready months ago, and then there was the privacy issues with it, and now they've gone back to a different model. And we've seen, as Chi mentioned, the algorithms, the algorithm will fix the A-level problems, and then obviously did not. So I think kind of what that really points to on where do we go from here is that, yes, digital services and technological solutions can help us with these really big challenges, but it needs to be based on evidence. It needs to be based on a real understanding of what different people, what different communities, what different groups need from these services, what they are getting from the services, what they're not yet getting, and how that can be rectified. And I think that means that this kind of democratic oversight of internet and digital services is really crucial as the kind of next, the way forward that we can try and start embedding those principles in how our relationship with the internet as a society kind of develops in the future.
Thanks. And just because it's been mentioned a few times, and I've tried to avoid talking about it because it could just absorb the entire conversation. The track and trace app came up thanks to you, Ellen. And I was a little close to that process as being part of the ethics board. And just one thing to riff off from what you just raised, it wasn't just a privacy problem that the app gave rise to. And I think this is where it is relevant to the topic being discussed on this panel. It's that it didn't work. That despite of all of our aspirations of how things would work, they didn't work in reality. And the technology comes and bites you. It says, no, we're just not going to work that way. And I think with all the optimism about the structure of the British economy and of the policy landscape, there's still the question as to whether or not our aspirations will work. And so to draw this phase of the panel to a close, we can go to the Q&A, and we have some questions that are coming in and being filtered. I'm very appreciative for the support, because it's hard to listen to these fascinating points that you're raising and deal with the discussions and all that. But just to summarize, I think there are three core dynamics coming out from this discussion. The first is the balance between the healthy economy, and it was very important what she raised around the social fabric that will emerge as a result of how the economy is shaped. And if the economy comes out negatively, the social fabric of the country will be negatively, well, yeah, it'll be a shit show. And then there's the question of the data chaos versus the role of regulation. And then third, and like Colville's point around infrastructure and breaking up infrastructure, not just being the tech infrastructure and asking the question, does it actually work, but the social and what he calls the policy level or the civic level of all of this. And then to ask whether or not those three dynamics can spread across the country, whether it's the geographic spread, the class spread, the business and industry size spread, and the question of will it spread to vulnerable people wherever they are and however they are made vulnerable in these situations, which is just fascinating. So thank you to the panel for this rich discussion, and hopefully gives rise to some fascinating questions. And from the discussion that I've seen in the chat, there are questions emerging around standards and the role that they play and whether they just lead to centralization. There are questions around the lack of trust, that whether it's in the regulators that exist and whether or not they're doing their jobs, or with the recent news about the lack of trust in the British government as to whether or not it will abide by the commitments that it has made. And then the question around training and skills and how is that going to be done? Is that going to be online? Because I can tell you, as somebody who runs an organization, online training just ain't working. Although that might be spread differently based on the types of people that particularly Ellen was articulating, where different types of people have different types of challenges when it comes to online, but some of them are more natural than others. And then what are we actually training people to do online, and what are we training them for this new economy? But to address some of the specific questions that are coming in, there's one asking one asking that big tech companies, big tech company issues can only be tackled internationally. How can that need be addressed, especially where some states harbor these bad actors and are unlikely to engage? And I can't even imagine which states we're talking about in this question. Does any of the panelists want to respond to that? Chief?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. It's one I hear all the time. And let me say, and you might say this is a typically political politician anchor, yes and no. I mean, I really do think, and I'll start with the yes, that it is better to address these challenges globally. And I think the global forums, such the Internet Forum, and particularly strong actors like the European Union, who has one of the largest in fact, the largest single market in the world, that has had a huge impact already on tech behavior, and we should be working internationally to do this. But it is a real cop-out, sorry, to say that this can only be addressed internationally. Companies make money locally, and it is ultimately in a business environment, and these are businesses, it is money and revenues which drive behaviors. And so follow the money. And the money is definitely being spent locally. It may be spent on the internet, but I tell you, it can be tracked, and it can be taxed locally, and it can be fined locally. And so, for example, we see in one of the things, praises for the government in terms of the digital services tax, though it's a bit opaque. This is the tax brought in by the UK government on the really large tech sector. It's a bit opaque about how they chose the level or whatever, but it is something that was done in the UK because the world fora for addressing this has been taking years and years and years to come up with something. And also, we have done this already. Let me tell you, we have done this in the UK in terms of broadband and telecommunications. If we are a leader in regulation, then you have a race to the top instead of a race to the bottom. So whilst we should work internationally, do not let that be a cop-out from working nationally, and particularly from this government bringing in place a robust regulatory framework for data and for online harms.
Thanks for that, Xi. I don't know if any of the other panelists want to weigh in on that, or do we want to move on to the other questions, because there's some. Yeah,
I'll just say quickly about speed of regulation and the challenge of getting international cohesion about it. Sometimes this is a real problem, and I'll give an example again. When we were looking at delivering a smart card platform, European alignment on that sort of standard was taking ages, and we launched the Oyster card not aligned with a European standard because we weren't sure when that was going to happen. In the end, it was several years afterwards that the standard was actually agreed. So there's a bit of push and pull. We can do, as she was highlighting, things locally and actually take innovation forward and drive standards rather than wait for international agreement on standards. I think it's a bit of a balance on some of those things, how we do it. But I think one of the other things I'll just say on trust in technology as we look at standards, losing public trust is easily done and very hard to gain. I again talk about sort of the Oyster card because it's a very usable, tangible thing people can understand. When launching it, we were conscious of many challenges, obviously, as I mentioned, cultural change, e-commerce, first time digital currency was going to be used, and people's confidence in that was going to be essential at a starting point. London was the first Western city to have that kind of platform. Hong Kong had obviously led the way. And it took, we had at least a year of shadow running to build confidence in that system, and many tangible things were done to build public trust. And when it then actually came into full usage, you could see adoption, engagement and trust being there, which has remained rock solid in the platform. We see now lots of services, obviously, that are accessible to people, including things like banks, which need trust. And as soon as we start eroding trust, and for example, start blaming the technology, blaming algorithms, we'll have a knock-on effect on all things that are using technology. And I think we need to be very careful with that, because it's not the technology that makes the mistake, it's not the algorithm, it's the people who are making decisions around it. And we have to make good and smart decisions. And fundamentally, yes, hold people accountable for those decisions. So let's just, I make a plea to not for us to fall into the trap of blaming algorithms and technology. The responsibility will still sit with people, and we must always remember that.
I agree, and I think the public trust question also has to apply to regulators. There was a fascinating article yesterday in the FT about how the regulator in the US, FAA, failed at its job of regulating Boeing. Boeing did everything it could to avoid being upfront with pilots, even how their planes operated, and we saw 2 plane crashes as a result. And there's a complete loss of faith in that regulator, and that doesn't leave anybody in a good situation. There's a question specifically aimed at Ellen, but I want to start with Ellen, but then move on to the others if they have any insights on how to answer it. The question is, does democratic oversight of digital services need to be institutionalized in some way involving the tech companies, civil society, and governments? And is this for regulators like Ofcom to consider?
So my short answer to that question is yes. I think, yeah, democratic oversight is a shorthand for, yeah, really needing some way to kind of institutionalize that as a process. Obviously, we're waiting on to see what's going to happen with the online harms regulation and where that's going to go. I think what I would hope to see coming out of that would be, as we've kind of talked about, real clarity on how a regulator like Ofcom, if that's the regulator that is chosen, how they will be making decisions, how there will be kind of oversight of if it was as systems change, as situations change, how they will respond to those. And Gus, you just made the point about kind of trust and regulation. I think clarity and transparency are going to be absolutely key if we're going to get public buy-in to regulation. People are very aware of the problems. People are very worried about the problems online. But we need to make sure that if we're coming up with regulations and solutions which propose to tackle them, that people are kind of understand why those decisions are being made, feel that they have a stake in that, and not just feel, but that they should have a stake in that, and that they should have kind of ways to engage in that. So I think, yeah, in terms of this specific question involving the tech companies, civil society, and government is absolutely crucial. I think you need all of those stakeholders, but I would also add kind of the general public to that list. And that it needs to be a conversation that's not just being had amongst certain kind of bubbles, but really we need to be reaching out wider and understanding what problems people need this sort of regulation to be solving.
Chi or Kavir, do you have any comments on that? Chi?
I'll just add, I think that's a really good summary from Ellen. I would add, having worked for Ofcom for 6 years, it's not a challenge to meet Facebook actually it was to begin with, because Facebook didn't actually want to. Facebook had the approach that if you ignored government, it would go away back in the early days. I think that has changed now, but it's never a challenge to meet the big companies. They have lawyers, they have, they won't send Zuckerberg or their chief executives, but they have hosts and hosts of people doing this. The challenge is to understand and to get the voice of people, citizens, and also of small businesses who are just so busy trying to keep up that they don't have time to meet with the regulator. And so that is why you really need to have a regulator which designs and engages and has means. And I think, obviously through technology, and citizen panels, etc., we could do a much better job of this now, that certainly than we are doing and then we have done in the past, of ensuring that consumers, citizens are involved and that their voice is heard. Because but I also think there is an obligation on the big companies who are engaging with their consumers on a second by second basis, who could also contribute, in terms of the democratic oversight. And I would say that the opposite of regulation is not no regulation, it is bad regulation. And to this point about don't blame the technology, which I agree with absolutely as a technologist, but people will do that. And I say put in place the strong regulatory framework before you have the scandal, before you have the child that commits suicide, before you have the algorithm that messes up people's lives. Put that in place, and then there will be trust in the technology and trust in society as well. And I still think it's not too late, and we have the opportunity to do that.
Thanks for that. Sorry, go ahead, Kavir.
Yeah, no, I was just going to add, I agree with you, Chi. I think that at this point, what we need is for government politicians to work alongside regulators and the private sector, and all three to come together, because there's just so much that needs to be done. And I think when you leave it to a regulator, then generally a regulator's playing catch up, let's be honest, okay? You know, commercial side's going way down the street, doing lots of stuff, and the regulator's desperately trying to keep up with them. And because it's such a political environment now as well, I think we need an era now where all three come together and look at what the future will hold, so they can work together to design for the future. And as she says, to avoid it once, you know, to avoid problems happening and then having to reverse engineer regulation, because the potential is so great. Now, this has been done before. You know, this is not new. We've seen the financial world get regulated after banking crisis. And yes, it's not perfect, right? There's always challenges. There's always more that can be done. But the FSA and the way governments looked at that and the way that they applied control is something that can be used as a model going forward. So I think that would be my plea.
It's that's very helpful. And just to stir the and you didn't intend to make it in the sense that regulators are trying to keep up because they're slow and technology moves fast. But I think what we've seen, linking with Chi's point of no regulation, doesn't the absence of regulation just means bad regulation. What we've seen is a sense of lawlessness behavior and willful lawlessness, and that comes nicely to the final question I'll put, and I'll adapt it slightly because the question's focused on dispute resolution. And so whether, I don't know if you saw the news last week about how Amazon on its comment section, it's fraudulent. There's a lot of fraudulent reviews, and those reviews influence whether or not commercial activity shall take place. And so there's a business in fraud when it comes to online. But also what we've seen is that the Amazons of the world have been able to trample on traditional business territory. And what's emerged is that the Amazons of the world don't have to expend as much infrastructure and money on dispute resolution. All they have is these online dispute resolution processes that are essentially comes down to the individual having to play the core role, versus when it's a traditional business, if you don't like the service you got, you go to that business and you seek resolution. And just to bring in another aspect of this was around the exams and the algorithms. And how basically the first response from the oversight body was like, don't come to us if you have a problem, because it's not our job. And so how, in order to build this trustworthy economy going forward, to not continue down this ruinous path of like, not just light regulation, but also light rights of redress and recourse, how do we solve that problem with our current processes that involve opinions and reviews, alternative dispute resolution processes, tribunals, courts? How do we make this accessible to everybody when it could be anybody, like within all those disparate populations that we've discussed, whether it's a geographic spread, the class spread, or whether people are vulnerable, or if it's small businesses or large businesses? How do we address this question of how do you hold to account when something has gone wrong? Anyone who wants to go at that one. Ellen, why don't we start with you?
Sure. So I think it's a really interesting question. I think there's definitely a role that data transparency has to play in terms of what information platforms are required, or different online services are required to provide to, for instance, a regulator. Because I think there's the individual kind of issues where, for instance, if it's a Amazon, as you say, somebody has paid for something and it's fraudulent, then there's going to be a specific process for that. But I think it's important also to have some kind of process whereby there's kind of redress and resolution around these more systemic problems that perhaps, you know, we're seeing USA around the election, US election misinformation goes through the roof. How do we fix that? How do we know that's happening, and how do we fix that? And I think having requirements on platforms to provide actual data from, you know, what systems have they put in place How effective has it been in reducing a certain amount of content? Not just kind of self-reporting on what they think is going on, but providing that data for independent assessment, so that we can identify what problems are occurring and then try and make recommendations based on the evidence of what's happening, about how those problems can be resolved at a macro level.
Oh, that's great. She?
Yeah, I think it's a question which sort of goes to the heart of the kind of society that we want to live in. And I'd say, you know, and I think I agree with most everything that Ellen said, but I'd also say you have to say, you know, who is it that you're holding to account? Who are you? You have to be able to establish that. You have to establish responsibility, you know, and that is what, you know, part of what the duty of care proposal in the online harms bill, which we may or may not see, is talking about. But who has a responsibility? Because you can't have redress unless you have someone to redress against. And there is we've talked about this already, such a disproportionate power imbalance. You know, if you talk about the technology environment versus the individual, and particularly the individual without the, you know, the digital skills which are increasingly needed. So you have to establish who's a duty of care responsibility. And then, you know, I think there's, you know, the US society is one which is based around liability and sort of like often a legal redress. We not traditionally, but have a society which is more based around regulation and guidance and, you know, means of enforcement. And that is what I would like to see. And I think that's part about having the right regulator. It's having established rights, you know, data rights, digital rights. I think when Ellen talked about, you know, that if you're the victim of a scam, even you don't even have, never mind having a redress against Amazon or Trustpilot for a false review. If you're the victim of a scam, your rights of redress, your rights of information against the scam that's been perpetrated against you are quite obscure. And, you know, the Digital Services Directive from the European Union addresses some of this, but not, I think, in the long term, looking forward with the issues of misinformation. Also, Internet of Things, smart devices. What happens when your toothbrush starts monitoring you, which is not what you paid for, etc. You know, these, you know, rights, principles, which allow a regulatory framework which doesn't have to change every time a new application comes on board, and then rights of guidance, regulation, and an effective enforcement. And also, just finally, and the big area of hope here, one area of hope, apart from having a proper regulatory framework, is also RegTech, regulation in technology, which means that, you know, just as much effort as Facebook goes into deciding what you might want to buy or see an advert for, could go into supporting and protecting your digital rights for what you have bought.
Great, thank you. Kalvir?
Yeah, look, I agree with a lot of what Ellen and she have said there, but there's also this question of, and it's a fundamental question we should all consider whenever we're doing anything now, is can we and should we? And I think that question, if we have a bit of check and balance around that, firstly, and I say that in all people who are involved in digital services and digital solutions, that's a starting point. But then to really get to your answer, to answer your question, Gus, which was a complex question, and we could take another hour and set you to get into it. But, you know, we've got to digitalize everything around the requirements that people have. So if it's a case of a dispute resolution, about access to managing an issue, this has got to be as slick and as easy as the original action and transaction was in the first place to partake in. We can't have it, yeah, you can, you know, do the commercial transaction, have the access, but actually when you try to get some recompense to it, it's very clunky, the legal side of it, the engagement side of it doesn't work. That is the balance that needs to be in place. So the processes, the accountability, which then, and we've already seen this, is then flowing back into a reputational conversation for both industry and the public sector, because if they get that bit right, they get a bonus on the reputational side, which comes back to our core principle of trust. So transparency, yes, but clear processes on either side of the fence, not just the transaction, but the recompense and how we go back on it. And then fundamentally a question of when we're doing something, I know we can, but should we? And a shameless plug here, I've put the link into the chat for us, is, you know, I've covered a lot of this stuff in our last thought leadership paper, which is a digital vision for a digital Britain. Now, we're talking about Britain, but a lot of these concepts apply across international boundaries. But that trust factor, I think, is going to be critical as we go forward. And, you know, I know it's great we've had Chi on the panel, because the politicians will play a huge part in how the public see trust, not only in the services they're using, but those who are providing them.
Thank you, and thank you. It's a great way to close it. And thank you to the panel. Thanks to all the participants and all the chat. I've really appreciated all the chat, and it's fed a lot of where the direction of this panel went. What's alarming to me, unfortunately, is that we're at this moment in time where I don't think it's ever happened before to this degree, but we have no certainty as to what the world and this country is going to look like in 6 months' time. And particularly with relation to this panel, we have no idea what role will infrastructure and regulation play. Like, just, it's completely blind what the infrastructure shall be and what the power and the competency and of regulators will be. And going back to Chi's very important point about the relationship between the economy and and society, we'll have no idea what is the social fabric of this country as a result. And that's quite staggering. But as a result of this panel, we'll have some of the indicators of what will be a sign of the health of what is coming. And that is around the effectiveness of, as identified by the panelists, the effectiveness of enforcement, the effectiveness of the tech, and the level of participation across society and industry and the market, and the power of our ability to seek redress if things have gone wrong. So thank you again to everybody. This has been a fascinating discussion, and it's a great way to draw to a close the UK IGF. I'll pass back to the organizers.